On April 22, 1872, a German laborer named John Myers left the Caisson beneath the Manhattan Tower of the Brooklyn Bridge, climbed through the airlock, and walked home. He had been working at the bottom of the East River for 2 days. The air pressure inside the Caisson, where he worked, was nearly 3 times normal atmospheric pressure, forced in by compressors to keep the river water from flooding the chamber, while men dug through the mud and rock of the riverbed 78 feet below the surface. When Myers reached the street, he felt a stabbing pain in his abdomen. Then his legs went numb. Then he collapsed. He was dead before anyone could help him. The cause was listed as unknown. 8 days later, an Irish laborer named Patrick Mackay came up from the same Caisson, walked a few blocks, and dropped. He was dead within hours. Within a month, another Irishman named Daniel Reardon followed them. 3 men dead in 5 weeks, all from the same chamber, all dying the same way. They went down healthy, they came up sick, and within hours their bodies failed. The project physician, Dr. Andrew Smith, had seen 110 cases of this mysterious illness during the construction. He called it Caisson disease. He was the first person to use that term. He had no idea what caused it. He knew only that men who worked under pressure at the bottom of the river emerged at the surface, and their bodies fell apart. And the deeper the Caisson sank, the worse it got, and there was nothing he could do about it. The Caisson was not a small machine. It was a building. The Brooklyn Bridge required 2 of them, one for each tower foundation. Each caisson was a massive inverted wooden box, open at the bottom and sealed at the top, built of yellow pine timbers, bolted together and sheathed in iron plate. The Brooklyn Caisson measured 172 feet long by 102 feet wide. The Manhattan Caisson was slightly smaller. Both were built in shipyards, launched into the East River like ships, towed into position, and sunk to the riverbed by piling granite blocks on top of them. As the weight of the granite pushed the Caisson into the mud, compressed air was pumped into the chamber through iron pipes, forcing the water out from underneath and creating a dry workspace at the bottom of the river where men could dig. The men entered through airlocks, vertical iron tubes fitted with pressure doors at top and bottom. To go down, a worker entered the upper door, sealed it behind him, and waited while the air pressure in the lock was slowly increased to match the pressure inside the caisson below. When the pressures equalized, the lower door opened and the worker descended into the chamber. To come up, the process was reversed. The worker entered the lock from below, the lower door sealed, and the pressure was gradually reduced to surface atmospheric pressure before the upper door opened. That was the theory. In practice, the decompression was fast, often just a few minutes, because the locks were small and the shifts were changing, and there were 100 men waiting to go down or come up. Nobody had time to sit in an iron tube while the pressure dropped at a rate that no one had yet determined was safe, because no one on Earth yet understood what the pressure was doing to the human body. The Brooklyn Bridge was not the first project to discover the cost of that ignorance. 2 years earlier, Captain James Eads had begun building a bridge across the Mississippi River at St. Louis using the same Caisson technology. The Eads Bridge caissons sank to 93 feet, deeper than anything attempted before. Construction proceeded without incident until the caissons reached 60 feet, and then the workers began to fall apart. They complained of joint pain so severe they could not stand straight. They complained of paralysis in their legs. They complained of headaches and a crawling itch beneath their skin that would not stop. Many of them emerged from the caisson bent at the waist, doubled over, unable to straighten. The posture resembled a fashionable women's stance of the era called the Grecian bend, and the workers mocked each other for it. They said a man was doing the bend. The name stuck. Dr. Alphonse Jaminet, a local physician hired by Eads set up a medical station on a barge beside the construction site, one of the first on-site occupational clinics in America. He required every worker to remain under his care for at least 1 hour after emerging from the Caisson, drinking 3/4 of a pint of strong beef tea. It was not enough. On March 19, 1870, a worker named James Riley completed a 2-hour shift in the Caisson. He emerged, walked a short distance, and collapsed, dead 15 minutes later. That same day, another man died. 3 days after that, 20 men were sent to the hospital in a single group. By the end of the Eads Bridge project, nearly 25% of all workers had suffered from Caisson disease. 13 were dead, 30 were hospitalized, 2 were permanently disabled. Jaminet himself went into the Caisson on February 28, 1870, spent 2 hours inside, and emerged barely able to walk. He was racked with pain, drenched in cold sweat, unable to speak without fainting. His pulse was 106. Both legs and his left arm were paralyzed. He spent several hours expecting to die. He recovered, and his written account of his own symptoms became the first detailed medical description of decompression sickness in history. He did not know what had caused it. He believed it was related to the speed of compression going down, not decompression coming up. He was wrong about the mechanism, but right about the principle. The pressure was killing the men, and the speed at which they moved through the pressure gradient determined whether they lived or died. Washington Roebling knew about the Eads Bridge disasters when he began the Brooklyn Bridge caissons. He had studied caisson construction in Europe. He understood the risks better than anyone alive. It did not matter. The Brooklyn caissons were 3 times larger than the ones at St. Louis. The river was deeper, and the disease struck harder. At the surface, the air we breathe is roughly 78% nitrogen. At normal atmospheric pressure, that nitrogen is dissolved in the blood and tissues at a low concentration. The body does not use it. It simply sits there, inert, balanced by the pressure of the air around it. When a worker descended into a caisson pressurized to 2 or 3 times atmospheric pressure, the partial pressure of nitrogen in the air increased proportionally, and the blood and tissues absorbed correspondingly more nitrogen. The deeper the caisson, the higher the pressure, the more nitrogen dissolved into the body. This was not painful. The worker felt nothing unusual while working under pressure. The danger came when he left. When the pressure dropped during the ascent through the airlock, the dissolved nitrogen needed time to come out of solution gradually, carried by the blood to the lungs and exhaled. If the pressure dropped too fast, the nitrogen came out of solution not gradually, but all at once, forming bubbles inside the blood and tissues. The bubbles were the disease. Small bubbles in the joints caused excruciating pain, the symptom that gave caisson disease its common name. Workers emerged from the airlock bent over at the waist, unable to straighten, the pain in their knees and hips and elbows so severe that they could not stand upright. Many of them, young and strong and Irish and German, collected their $4 in pay, walked straight from the airlock to the nearest saloon on the waterfront and drank whiskey until the pain subsided. Both Jaminet at the Eads Bridge and Smith at the Brooklyn Bridge believed that the saloon visits made the disease worse. They were probably right, though not for the reasons they thought. Alcohol dilates blood vessels and may accelerate the formation of bubbles in a body already saturated with excess nitrogen. Smith observed that the workers most likely to suffer severe caisson disease were those who were overweight. He noted that every fatality during his tenure occurred in a heavier man. He did not understand why, but the reason is straightforward. Fat tissue absorbs more nitrogen than lean tissue and releases it more slowly. A heavy man carried more dissolved gas in his body when he stepped into the airlock, and the gas took longer to come out. Smith treated stricken workers with morphine and atropine, which did nothing for the bubbles but dulled the agony enough to keep the men from screaming. The posture resembled a fashionable women's stance of the era called the Grecian bend, and the workers' peers mocked them for it. They said the men were doing the bend. The name stuck. They called it the bends, but the bends were the mild form. Large bubbles forming in the spinal cord cause paralysis. Bubbles in the brain cause stroke, seizure, loss of speech, loss of consciousness. Bubbles forming in the blood vessels of the lungs cause the chokes, a condition in which the worker could not breathe, his chest tightening as the gas expanded in the pulmonary vasculature. In the worst cases, massive bubble formation caused cardiovascular collapse. The heart could not pump blood that was foaming with nitrogen gas. The worker went into shock. The worker died. And because nobody in 1872 understood that the disease was caused by dissolved gas coming out of solution, the cause remained unknown, and nobody knew how to prevent it or how to treat it. Dr. Smith observed that the disease struck harder as the caisson went deeper. He observed that longer shifts correlated with worse outcomes. He observed that some men were stricken and others were not, and he could not explain why. He recorded everything. He published his findings. He was honest about the limits of his understanding. He did not use recompression to treat stricken workers because the concept had not yet been developed and because he considered it too dangerous to send a dying man back into the pressure chamber that had made him sick in the first place. Inside the caisson, the conditions were hellish in ways that had nothing to do with nitrogen. The compressed air did strange things to the senses. Voices became high-pitched and nasal. It was impossible to whistle. Candles, when blown out, seemed to relight themselves in the oxygen-rich atmosphere, the increased pressure making combustion behave in ways that felt supernatural to men who had never experienced compressed air before. The temperature was around 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity was absolute. The men worked half-naked in air so thick with moisture it beaded on their skin and dripped from the timber ceiling. The light was dim, provided by calcium carbide lamps that guttered and smoked in the compressed atmosphere, filling the chamber with carbon dioxide that made the men's hearts race and their heads pound. Dr. Smith, the Brooklyn Bridge physician, correctly identified the elevated carbon dioxide from the lamps as the cause of the racing heartbeats, one of the few things about the caisson environment he got right. The floor was mud and rock and standing water. There were no toilets in the early months of the Brooklyn caisson. The smell was what you would expect from a sealed chamber at the bottom of a river in which over 100 men worked in shifts around the clock, sweating, breathing, and relieving themselves in corners. An engineer named Farrington, visiting the caisson, described the scene and said it brought vividly to life Dante's Inferno. Half-naked bodies, laboring in dim, uncertain light in a chamber, buried beneath a river. 2,500 men worked in the Brooklyn caisson over the course of construction, and the turnover was enormous because the men could not tolerate the conditions. 3 shifts ran daily, 6 days a week, 112 men on each day shift, and 40 on the night shift. The work was digging. The men used shovels and picks to excavate the mud and boulders from beneath the cutting edge of the caisson, and as they dug, the caisson sank under the weight of the granite accumulating on top of it, inch by inch, foot by foot, descending toward the bedrock that would support the bridge tower above. Boulders too large to remove by hand were broken up with blasting powder, and the blasts in the confined, pressurized space were concussive in a way that open-air blasting was not. The compressed air amplified every sound. The pressure made fires burn hotter and faster. On December 2nd, 1870, a fire broke out inside the Brooklyn caisson when a candle flame reached the oakum caulking in the ceiling timbers. The compressed air turned what would have been a minor fire on the surface into a roaring blaze that burned for hours before it was extinguished by flooding the chamber. The caisson survived, barely. The fire weakened the timbers so severely that an additional 5 layers of pine had to be bolted over the damaged section. Washington Roebling spent more time in the caissons than any other person on the project. As chief engineer, he felt obligated to inspect every phase of the work personally. In early 1872, after working 12 straight hours in the Manhattan caisson, he rose to the surface too quickly. He collapsed. He was carried to his home in Brooklyn Heights, and he did not leave it as a healthy man again. The caisson disease destroyed his nervous system. He suffered chronic pain, partial paralysis, impaired vision, and difficulty speaking for the rest of his life. He was 34 years old. For the remaining 11 years of the bridge's construction, Roebling directed the project from his bedroom, watching through a telescope, dictating instructions to his wife Emily, who carried them to the site and relayed them to the assistant engineers. Emily Roebling taught herself the mathematics of suspension bridge design, the calculations of catenary curves, the specifications of cable construction, and she became the de facto chief engineer of the most ambitious infrastructure project in the world, managing it day to day, while her husband watched from a window, and the men who had worked beside him in the Caisson died or lived diminished lives in the neighborhood surrounding the bridge they were building. The Brooklyn Bridge opened on May 24, 1883. 20 men had died during its construction. Over 100 had been sickened by Caisson disease. Washington Roebling watched the opening ceremony from his bedroom. President Chester Arthur walked across the bridge accompanied by Emily Roebling. The bridge was declared the 8th wonder of the world. It was the longest suspension bridge ever built. The caissons that supported its towers sat on the riverbed where they had been sunk more than a decade earlier, sealed in granite, invisible, permanent. The men who had dug them out were scattered across Brooklyn and Manhattan, some recovered, some crippled, some dead, none of them named on the bridge they built. The disease that killed them would not be fully understood for another 30 years when the French physiologist Paul Bert proved that rapid decompression caused nitrogen bubbles to form in the blood. In 1889, Ernest William Moyer, working on the Hudson River Tunnel, installed the first recompression chamber and reduced the death rate from 25% to nearly zero. Before Moyer's chamber, the death rate on that tunnel project had been 25%. After the chamber was installed, only 2 workers died out of the next 120 cases. The technology that would have saved the Brooklyn Bridge workers arrived 17 years too late. By 1904, tunnel construction to and from Manhattan Island had caused over 3,000 injuries and more than 30 deaths from Caisson disease, and the cumulative toll finally forced the passage of laws requiring pressure limits and decompression schedules for compressed air workers. The workers were called sandhogs, and they continued to build the tunnels and bridge foundations of New York City for the next century, descending into pressurized chambers beneath the rivers, digging through mud and rock, and coming back up according to schedules written in the blood of the men who went before them. That knowledge came too late for the men who built the bridge. They went down into the pressure because the work paid well and the bridge needed building, and they came up because their shift was over, and the nitrogen in their blood did what nitrogen does when the pressure drops too fast. It formed bubbles, and the bubbles did what bubbles do inside a human body. They destroyed whatever they touched. If this is the kind of history that stays with you, subscribe. There are more machines like this one, and every one of them left a body count the world forgot.